Something we are often asked about is how to use varnishes, because using a varnish can be a very scary prospect. If you imagine your model is completed and you put a lot of work into it and then you're about to spray it with this varnish that has a reputation for maybe not always turning out just right, well, it can ruin a miniature and waste all of that time, and this hurts, believe me, I know. Now in this video, what we're going to be doing is talking about varnishes and why you might want to use them, and then of course how to use them, and we're going to give you some really important information that you need to know to get the most out of them. We hope you enjoy this video, and well, let's get to it. So what is a varnish? Well, essentially a varnish is a clear liquid that you paint over your miniatures to give it a particular finish once it's dry, but also a protective coating as well. When it comes to that finish, what you've got is two extremes, first of all. On one hand of this, you've got gloss or high gloss, and this is where it's really shiny and almost reflective. On the other end of the scale, what you've got is matte or dead matte, and in this case, it's the opposite. It's basically really flat and quite dull by comparison. Most of the time, what you're going to be looking for is something in between these two extremes, and this is what we call satin, where it's sort of on the matte side of things, but it's not completely matte. There's a little bit of a sheen to it, which allows the colour to come through. Now, if you've been using some hobby paints, then these will generally dry with a satin finish. So if you've not used a varnish before, you'll be quite used to what this looks like. I've got three examples that I've painted up to show you what these look like once they're completely dry. I've got 3 Roman legionaries for this, and we'll start out with the gloss varnish one. This one you can see is basically really shiny, particularly shiny on that shield, and it looks quite nice on the armour, but on the clothing, it just looks a bit weird, and same on the skin as well. So to compare that to what we've also got is a matte varnished one, and here he is. You can see that he's quite dull, especially when it comes to that shield. You can really see the difference there on the metals, but looks a little bit better on the fabric. But if we look at the two next to each other, you can see just how extreme the difference is, really. It's very, very different on the two. Now, when it comes to the satin, we're looking at, as I say, something that's in between those. And, well, this is what the satin one looks like. You can see the colours coming through nicely. The shield looks a little bit like the matte one, but if I bring up the matte one as well and put them right next to each other, you can see that whilst the shields are similar, if we go around to the armour, you can see the metallic is quite different. On the satin one on the left, you can see it's shinier, particularly across those shoulders, whereas on the matte one on the right, it's much duller by comparison. Now, this brings us on to the protective layer that a varnish puts on top of the miniature, which is ideal if you're going to be handling them a lot, because over time, if you're wargaming with your figures and moving them around with your fingers, you'll start to rub some of that paint off the miniature, particularly where highlights and things are going to be on edges. So in this case, having a varnish protects that. Well, stops it from happening, really. It just allows you to handle your models without any risk of that going on over time. So if you're going to be wargaming a lot with your figures, then I definitely recommend that you varnish them. So now you know what a varnish is, we're going to take a look at the different ways of applying it. And there are two to go through here. First of all, what you got is spray varnish, which appears in aerosol cans like this one just here. This is Munitorum varnish from Citadel. This is a great one, this. Nice satin varnish that I use quite a lot. It's ideal if you're looking to be varnishing a lot of models very quickly, because it's like using a spray undercoat. You can just line them up and spray them all at once. It's also great if you're looking to spray large miniatures, especially ones with large armour panels. So for example, something like an Imperial Knight, where you want that smooth, consistent finish on those armour plates. This is great for that sort of thing because it will give you that result. Now, on the other hand, a spray like this is notorious for being a little bit temperamental, and this certainly is true. We'll talk more about that soon, but there are some very important things that you have to know about before you commit to using a varnish like this. Now, this brings us to the other sort of varnish, which is the kind that you apply by hand. And this sort of varnish appears in all sorts of shapes and sizes. There are loads of different makes of it out there. Here's one from Citadel. This is Ard Coat. This is a gloss varnish. But likewise, I've got one here from AK Interactive, which is their ultra matte varnish in a dropper bottle. So you can see it's all different shapes and sizes. So there's all different sorts for different tastes there. Now, the great thing about this sort of varnish is I find it to be a little bit more reliable than using the spray varnish. And it allows you a great degree of control, because you can pick out different parts of your miniatures to get different finishes for them, and this applies a whole extra dimension of painting your miniatures. So for example, with those Romans earlier, what you could do is paint all their armor with a gloss varnish, then paint everything else like the clothing and the skin using a matte varnish, and this gives a really nice contrast between these materials. Now, this does mean, of course, you have to apply it by hand, and some of these you can apply with an airbrush, so it varies depending on the make. If you're applying it by hand, it obviously takes longer than using a spray, but it's okay once you get into a rhythm. You can rattle through it, but it's something to bear in mind. And this, of course, brings us back to the spray varnish, which is much faster. And now what we're going to do is take a look at applying that kind of varnish. Like the paint-on version of varnishes, spray varnishes come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So, for example, I've got two here. We've got the Minotaur Varnish once again from Citadel. We've also got this one called Rail Match, which you can see is in a smaller can. And, well, these are quite different. So varnishes are often made up in very different ways in the chemicals inside them. So it is very important that you're aware of any individual quirks of that particular varnish. So this means always read the instructions before you use it, because you need to be aware of this sort of thing. Also be aware that varnishes have different drying times. So in some cases, they'll take a long time, up to 24 hours, for example, whereas sometimes they'll be really quick, which is one of the reasons I like Minotaur and Varnish, because it's touch dry so fast in about 15 minutes after you've used it. Now, to actually use the spray, what you need to do is to set up as if you're going to be undercoating a model, which means, first of all, making sure you shake the can. Now, this is again a really important thing because you have to make sure the varnish is evenly mixed inside the can, so make sure you shake it for quite a long time. On the can, it will typically say something like 2 minutes, but personally, I'd recommend doubling that just to be sure. Then what you should do is do a quick test to make sure it's spraying correctly, so you can just spray it on a piece of cardboard or something like that, just to see what's happening. Perhaps a spare miniature that you're not really bothered about anymore, just to make sure nothing strange is going to happen before you commit to your miniature. And then spraying the miniature is much like spraying an undercoat. What you want to do is have some way to hold the miniature so you're not holding the model directly, so perhaps a piece of cardboard to put it on, or a stick where you can just temporarily tack it to it, something like that. And then to apply the spray, point the can away from the miniature, just to the side of it, about 20 to 30 centimeters away from it, then move across it in waves, sort of spraying across it. And what this will do is ensure a nice even application. Now, you can do multiple coats of this to make sure that you've got all the details, all the nooks and crannies, things like that. And if you're going to do this, just make sure that each coat is completely dry before you do the next one, because as in many cases, it's all about applying multiple thin coats here. Once you're done, the last thing to do is to turn the can upside down and spray it until the spray turns clear. And this is to make sure that you've got all the varnish out of the nozzle of the spray can, because it can dry in there and start to gum things up. So it's a good idea to get it clear to make sure nothing's hidden in there for the next time you're going to be using it. Now, this does bring me to a top tip here, which sounds a little bit silly, but it is really, really important, and that is to make sure you have the right can when you're going to spray a model with the varnish. Make sure it is the varnish, because, well, as I say, it sounds silly, but I have seen people in the Games Workshop studio have fully painted the model and get the wrong can by accident. And to show you how easy this is to do, we've got the Minotaur and Varnish here once again, but you can see it's very similar to a can of lead belcher, and if you're not paying attention, well, you can grab the paint by accident. And as I say, in the Games Workshop studio, I did see this happen, where the model was all fully painted and beautiful, and then it's sprayed with a primer. Now, needless to say, this is a horrible experience to witness and certainly to happen to you. And whilst looking back at it 10 years later, it is sort of funny. At the time, it really wasn't. Now, as we mentioned, you don't have to use a spray varnish. You can instead paint varnish on by hand, and that's what we're going to take a look at now. The one I've got is one from Vallejo for this one. So this is some Vallejo matte varnish this. And to use this sort of thing, it's a lot like applying a wash all across the miniature. First thing to do is to make sure you thoroughly shake it, to make sure it's nicely mixed, of course, making sure the lid's fully closed too. And then what you'll need is a palette or a dimple tray like I've got here. And using this sort of stuff is just a matter of popping some into it. So I'm just going to pour some in there, and there we go. Now, if it's water-based like this one is, you can thin it down with water, and this can have an effect on the overall appearance of what it looks like once it's dry. So, for example, a gloss one, if you want to tone it down a little bit, you can just thin it down with water if you wanted to. In this case, what I'm going to do is just, well, make sure the brush is damp before I apply it. And to apply it, so you do want a good large brush like this one here. This is a medium shade brush from Citadel. And to use it, it's just a matter of loading up on your brush and then just painting it all over your model. Now, using this is, as I mentioned, a lot like applying a wash across your figure. So you need to make sure that you're careful in the application to make sure it doesn't gum up too much in any one area in particular. So for a figure like this, if I put a larger amount on, you can see it really can start to clog up, and it's not immediately obvious, so you do have to pay attention. But you can see around here, a lot of it is really built up around that dagger. So what I'm going to do is just move it away, redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature before it dries. Now, the drying time will vary depending on the make that you're going for, and this is a matter of, once again, just making sure you read the instructions. In the case of this one, it takes about an hour to dry, so I'm just going to leave it for an hour, then we'll come back and see the result. Once that first coat is completely dry, if there are any parts that are a little bit uneven, remember you can always add a second thin coat if you want to, just to ensure you get that even coverage before your model is finished. The second coat's now completely dry, and you can see it's given a really nice even finish on the miniature. And so using paint on varnish is pretty much as simple as that. As you've seen, it gives much more control than using a spray, and it's a bit more reliable too, but also it does take a little bit longer to do, so just something to bear in mind. But with that done, we're now going to move on to some top tips for using varnishes. first top tip we're going to take a look at is how to best protect your miniatures, because gloss varnish is more hard wearing than matte or satin varnish, but it doesn't quite look right on most details like clothing and things like that. So if you just paint it with gloss varnish, things look sort of weird. So what you can do is first of all paint the model with the gloss varnish and then go over it with a matte or a satin varnish to whichever sort of finish that you prefer. This way you get the best of both worlds. You get that toughness from the gloss, but also you get the right sort of finish too. So we're going to demonstrate that now on one of our Romans, and to do this what I've got is some Ard Coat, which is one from Citadel. A nice gloss varnish this one, but straight out the pot is a little bit too thick for our purposes here because it can very easily clog detail. You'll see it's quite a thick one, this. I'm still using that shade brush to get it ready, but because this is a water-based one, what we can do is just add a little bit of water to it to thin it down. So just a small amount mixed in there. So if you're getting a paint ready, just add as much as you need to bring it down to about that sort of consistency there. And then all you do is just paint it all across your miniature. Now this isn't about shading or anything like that, it's just about getting an even coating across everything. So be sure to work into all the nooks and crannies, but just keep an eye on it to make sure it's not gumming up any detail. The gloss varnish is now completely dry, and you can see it looks kind of weird, especially on all the clothing around there, but it's okay because what we can do is just paint over it with a matte or a satin varnish. In this case I'm using the matte varnish from Vallejo once again, and it's just a matter of applying that thin coat all over the miniature. Now because this is going over such a glossy varnish, it's probably going to take 2 coats, but just remember to keep each coat thin to ensure it doesn't clog up any detail. With those 2 coats of the matte varnish applied, you can see now things have been toned down much more. It's no longer super shiny, looking much better and much more appropriate for a Roman soldier. So as you've seen, doing that's nice and simple, but now it's going to last a long time because of that extra protective layer that we've got underneath that matte varnish. The second tip we've got is to use different varnishes on different parts of the model to give different finishes that are appropriate to the surface that you're applying them on. And we alluded to this earlier on with the example of a Roman when we were talking about keeping the armour shiny and then really matting down all the clothes and things, because this can look a little bit strange on models, especially where there's lots of metallics where you use one finish and put it across everything. And we've got a great example of that just here with the Stormcast Eternal, who, if you take a look at his shield, it's been matted down, but the rest of the armour, well, that hasn't. It's still metallic, and you can see the two don't match at all. This looks kind of weird now. So what we can do is carefully apply a gloss varnish onto the metallic parts to help them match back the rest of that gold armour that we've got. So to do this, I'm just going to use some Ard Coat again, but this time rather than just painting it all across the miniature, you just have to be a little bit more careful in the application. So what I've got here is a medium layer brush from Citadel, and I'm going to apply the varnish as if I was layering with things. So looking at applying it over the flatter surfaces and avoiding the recesses, because we don't want it really shiny in the corners or anything, so it'll just look wet. Instead, we just want it on the flat surfaces and the raised areas. Now I am going to water it down with a little bit of water once again, and I'm using my flat palette this time just to clearly see what's happening with the paint and seeing how it's behaving, because I just want to bring it down to about that point there. And like with layering, it's a matter of removing excess varnish from the brush to make sure it's not overloaded. And then what you do is just carefully start applying it onto those flatter surfaces and the raised surfaces and avoid the recesses. So for example, just following the crest of this part just here and the flat just up here. But when I get close to the rivet just in there, I don't want to go quite into the recess around it, just to keep it a little bit darker in those areas and not so shiny. With that varnish now dry on the gold, you can see now it's brought that shine back to it, and now it matches nicely in with the rest of the armour once again. And so as you've seen, doing that is really easy, but remember when you're approaching it in this way by putting the gloss on top of another sort of varnish, just remember to treat it like a layer and avoid the recesses so as to keep the effect consistent with the rest of the metallic. Our third tip for using varnishes is that you can actually mix them together to get different sorts of results with them, and this includes using mediums with them as well. And this brings me to my favourite combination, which is a mix that I found after a lot of experimenting, because on my miniatures what I like is to have a matte finish, but not so matte that it starts to lose all life in the model. And I found the closest one to this that was consistent was actually Ultra Matte Varnish from AK Interactive. But this one is so matte that it does take a lot of life out of the colours, so what I started doing was mixing it with contrast medium from Citadel and found that this gave the sort of result that I really like. So I'm going to show you that mix now. To make it, what we're going to do is mix them together at about 50-50. So I'll start with the Ultra Matte Varnish. And you can see I've got my flat palette here for this one so we can see it clearly, and I've got 2 drops there. What I'm looking for is roughly the same with the contrast paint. Now, it doesn't have to be exact, just as long as it's close to it is absolutely fine. And I find using one of these medium shade brushes from Citadel is good for this sort of thing. And I just want to get a good brush full of that and put it next to it on the palette. Looks like I need just a little bit more, so there we go. then it's just a matter of mixing them together. And we want them to be really thoroughly mixed so that it's all evenly distributed amongst it. So really make sure to work it together like that. And once that's done, then all we need to do is paint it across the miniature. Now the one I've got for this is an Imperial Fist that we painted in a previous video. You can see has been based with static grass, and you can varnish a miniature that's got this on here if you're doing it by hand anyway. You just got to be careful not to get any of that static grass into the varnish as you apply it so it doesn't get stuck onto the miniature. But you can see it's just a matter of painting this all over and leaving it for about 20 minutes to dry. That mix is now completely dry, and you can see it's given a really even finish to all those flat armor panels, but also it's given it that sort of near matte finish that I was going for, whilst also not taking all the life out of the colours, including those metallics. So it's a great little mix that you can use. I've been using it for ages. But there you go, that's how I like to use varnishes, and the key things to remember here are they're great for protecting your miniatures, especially if you're going to be wargaming with them a lot, but also you can use them to get the right sort of finish that you want on your miniatures, so really useful to know. One key thing to remember though is if you're going to be using a spray varnish, remember to always make sure you read the instructions on the can, just so you're aware of any little quirks about that particular make of it, just so it doesn't cause any problems with your miniatures. But there you go, have fun using your varnishes, and we'll see you again very soon.